They didn't even notice me when I walked into the room. It was as if I were just a shadow passing through the tinted windows of the 39th floor boardroom in Manhattan, where multi-million-dollar decisions were made every week. I sat there, carefully opening my silver laptop, trying not to draw attention to myself, because I knew that no one there would listen to me anyway. The directors in their burgundy ties, the executives in their heels that clicked firmly on the marble, they were all talking loudly, laughing among themselves, exchanging inside jokes. And me? I was just the data analyst, the one who received terse emails like, "Run the reports by 5 p.m. Never a good morning, never a how are you. At board meetings I became a prop, almost decorative, as they discussed inflated marketing strategies and fanciful projections that I knew wouldn't survive 2 bad quarters. But when I tried to speak up, to warn about glaring discrepancies in dashboards, or about clients about to terminate contracts due to gross service failures, I was interrupted by a raised hand or worse, a blank stare that quickly shifted to my Rolex wristwatch. Until one day, after yet another veiled humiliation, something inside me snapped. I began to plan silently. I decided to create a clandestine algorithm, one that they hadn't asked for, or even imagined. And I began working on it every night, locked in my tiny rented studio in Brooklyn, between cups of cold coffee and dark circles that deepened with each line of code. I knew that if the company continued on this path, it wouldn't last a year. So I created a predictive system, powered by machine learning, that intersected variables they didn't even know existed: churn behavior, industry-specific macroeconomic swings, and even sentiment gleaned from obscure mentions on online forums. It had been 3 months of no social life, no answering messages from friends, and my body running on nothing but caffeine and despair. But by the end of it, I had something revolutionary, a script that not only predicted which contracts were about to collapse, but also showed exactly how to turn each situation around, almost as if by magic. The morning I decided to drop my silent bomb, I was once again ignored in the meeting. But when I asked to speak for the 4th time, I picked up my laptop, plugged it into the room's main screen, and ran the algorithm live, without warning. The chart flashed on the screen. There was an awkward silence. Then the lines began to move, predicting catastrophic losses, but then displaying detailed strategies for turning the tables. For the first time, I had their full attention, and they went pale. The silence was soon broken by a nervous cough from one of the partners, followed by the uncomfortable creaking of chairs as everyone leaned forward, trying to decipher what this meant. I kept the cursor blinking, letting the tension linger to the point of absolute embarrassment. Then I clicked to display the full dashboard, a cascade of predicted contract breaches, financial leaks, and trends that no one there had even dreamed of mapping. The projection showed clearly that if they continued to focus solely on the shallow marketing strategies they love to repeat so much in their colorful presentations, they would lose 43% of key contracts in the next 6 months. The commercial director's face turned as pale as chalk. The CFO began to drum her fingers frantically on the mahogany desk, unable to disguise her panic. Then came the final blow. My algorithm not only diagnosed the impending collapse, it provided automatic recommendations for how to approach each at-risk client, adjusted based on their relationship history, and even subjective factors such as recent changes in their leadership profiles. It was like having a corporate oracle, only anchored in solid data. When I finished displaying the dashboard, I closed the laptop with a sharp click and waited. For a few seconds, no one had the courage to say anything. Then the CEO, a man known for his arrogant demeanor and inability to contain his vanity, tried to regain control by asking why the hell I had never presented this before. I looked at him with the cool calm that had been maturing for months, and simply said that I had tried, that had been constantly ignored. Right there, in that raw confession, something broke definitively in the informal hierarchy of the room. They realized that they had neglected not only a talent, but the only possible salvation. The CEO cleared his throat and glanced awkwardly at the rest of the board before finally asking what. I needed to implement this immediately. I allowed myself a second to take a deep breath and feel the weight of the complete reversal of roles. Then, in the same calm voice that had always been despised, I stated that I would need a dedicated team, complete technical autonomy, and a new title that would give me real authority to drive change, a title that would put me above all those managers and directors who had so often made fun of me. The CEO took a deep breath, looked at the others, who seemed petrified, and then nodded. And so, in a single morning, I went from being an invisible analyst to vice president of strategic operations. In that instant, I began to completely redesign the structure of the company, driven not only by a desire to avoid disaster, but also by something darker, an almost visceral need to prove that the price of their arrogance would not be cheap. The first few days were a silent spectacle of shock and recalibration. The same executives who had previously not bothered to respond to my emails now lined up like fearful students, awaiting instructions. I watched each of them with the precision of someone who finally had a scalpel in hand, carefully analyzing which areas needed to be excised to stop the tumor of incompetence from spreading. My first act was to request internal reports that no one had reviewed in years, shelved contracts, sales pipelines inflated by empty promises, budgets doctored to please investors on quarterly calls. As I sifted through the piles of data, it became clear how wrong they had been to ignore me. I discovered that some of the most arrogant executives had manipulated targets and hidden significant losses just to secure their fat bonuses, while blaming the teams at the bottom. This fed something inside me, a cold fire that burned for greater purposes than simply saving the company. I wanted to expose each and every one of the rotten parts. One by one, I set up private meetings, forcing each leader to justify their operations in front of me, cross-referencing real-time information with reports from my algorithm. Many couldn't stand up to scrutiny and began to stutter, sweat, and invent pathetic excuses. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to make explicit threats. The power was all on my screen, in the graphs that jumped with each command, revealing silent betrayals and chronic mismanagement. In less than a month, the executive board was reshuffled. 2 directors were forced to resign for personal reasons, after I presented detailed reports of negligence that could easily lead to lawsuits. Others, realizing the fate that awaited them, began to cooperate in an almost servile manner. Meanwhile, I began to cultivate strategic alliances with a few middle managers and forgotten analysts, people who had real talent but had been stifled by the old culture of vanity and politicking. They became my eyes and ears in each department, bringing me raw, unfiltered information before any crisis could take shape. At the same time, I ordered surgical cuts to unproductive projects and redirected resources to initiatives that my predictive system identified as crucial to the firm's future. It was an exhausting period, with shifts that began before sunrise and ended when the city outside had already fallen silent. But each day I cemented my dominance more and more. I could see it in their eyes, the fear, the uncomfortable respect, the need to align themselves with the new power that now guided every strategic decision. The taste was bitter, but addictive. As I consolidated my control over every inch of that corporation, something curious began to happen. Investors who had previously been just names in annual reports and fleeting faces at conferences began to seek direct meetings with me. They arrived wearing impeccable suits and giving rehearsed speeches, trying to get me to make predictions or some kind of confirmation that their capital would be safe. I would receive them in a glass-enclosed room in the highest corner of the building, with the city stretching out in the distance like a living grey carpet. There, when I presented the projections of my algorithm, I would show the company's future not as a promise inflated by PowerPoints, but as a clear path supported by data so indisputable that it made them discreetly clasp their expensive rings or snap their fingers in involuntary nervousness. This new position had consequences beyond what I expected. Board meetings began to revolve around me, even when I remained silent, simply observing. I saw experienced executives stumble over flimsy arguments, contradicting themselves in the face of the reports that I would release with the ease of someone carrying dynamite in their pocket. Some tried to whisper rumors in the hallways, speculating that I had only achieved so much power because I had something dirty on my hands. Little did they know that they were right, but not for the reasons they thought. I kept entire folders of private audits that I had commissioned without anyone's knowledge, mapping out the ethical and accounting failures that could destroy entire reputations in a matter of hours. This guaranteed me absolute silence when I decided to fire someone or close a project without leaving room for objection. It was a dark chess game, in which I would advance pieces and sacrifice entire rooks without batting an eye. But it wasn't just about corporate control. There was something deeply personal about watching, bit by bit, the same toxic culture that had ignored me being dismantled by my own hands. At night, when I returned to my apartment, I would often throw my coat on the couch and stand in front of the window, reliving every humiliation I had suffered. I remembered the condescending smiles, the glances that passed right by me, as if I were invisible, the invitations for coffee that never came, the brilliant ideas that had been trampled on by mediocre vanity. And now I was the epicenter of it all. Even so, an uncomfortable emptiness insisted on settling inside my chest. Maybe it was the inevitable price of leading an empire from the brink of collapse back to stability, using methods that bordered on blackmail and manipulation. Or maybe it was simply the cold realization that there was no victory without deep scars. When I realized this, I decided that I would not be content with just saving the company. I wanted to transform it into a brutal example of what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. I began to redesign the long-term goals, not only to ensure solid profits, but to establish almost insurmountable barriers for anyone who tried to replicate what I was building. My algorithm became a living organism, fed by data from suppliers, customers, the global market, and even socioeconomic factors that completely escape the radar of traditional executives. I hired obscure mathematicians, statisticians who had previously worked at top-secret hedge funds, and brought them into my project under such strict confidentiality agreements that any leak would mean not just termination but lifelong financial ruin. The corporation began to grow so aggressively and meticulously that rumors soon began circulating in the market that we were quietly destroying entire competitors without formal acquisitions. Some smaller brands simply disappeared, swallowed up by indirect mergers, and by our ability to offer our customers solutions so customized that it became almost impossible for them to even consider switching to another supplier. I watched all this with the serenity of someone who had masterminded every step of the way, but without the euphoria that many expected from someone who had achieved so much in such a short time. The flame that burned inside me was not one of celebration, but of fully satisfied revenge. I wanted all those who had once ignored or doubted me to understand that they had directly contributed to the corporate monster that now loomed over them. And at night, when I lay alone in the darkness of my room, I felt the paradoxical weight of having completely won, and, at the same time, having lost every trace of the person who once just wanted to be heard in a simple meeting room. Time passed, and with it, my image became consolidated not only within the company, but in the market as a whole. Articles began to appear in business and financial portals, pointing to me as the cool mind behind the turnaround of a conglomerate that was about to be swallowed up by its own debts. They were complimentary texts, but always loaded with a certain veiled fear. Interviews with anonymous sources spoke of my ruthless way of managing processes, of the way I cut entire departments without hesitation, of the clinical way in which I used data not only to guide strategies, but to isolate and neutralize internal threats before they even matured. On the outside, I presented myself with the same restrained smile as always, sober clothes, impeccable posture, but on the inside I was delighted to realize that I had become almost a corporate myth, a story that employees whispered in the hallways, and that board members were afraid to even mention outside of official meetings. The interesting thing is that, in this process, many of my former tormentors began to crawl in search of my approval. People who would never have paid a compliment before were trying to please me, bringing detailed reports and praising my initiatives in public, as if that could buy my benevolence. Little did they know that the only currency that really interested me was cold and absolute efficiency, and that flattery without results earned me more contempt than silence. Within this new ecosystem that I had created, I selected a few allies. They were not necessarily friendly, nor docile, but they shared the same appreciation for meticulous perfection and for the pragmatism that did not waver in the face of simplistic moral dilemmas. Together, we were like surgeons operating on a high-risk patient, with no room for sentimentality that could compromise the survival of the larger body. However, even though I was at the height of my power on the outside, on the inside I began to notice small cracks forming. Sleepless nights became the rule, not the exception. I found myself obsessively revisiting the first reports I had written as an analyst, almost as if searching for a distant memory of who I once was. There was something melancholic about reviewing those simple spreadsheets, put together with almost youthful zeal, compared to the monstrously complex models that now fed my decisions. It was like looking at old photographs and realizing that the person in the picture no longer has their eyes. Still, every morning, when I finally put down my laptop and went to the window, I felt a perverse relief when I contemplated the city spread out below me. It wasn't peace, far from it, but it was concrete confirmation that, despite all the emotional mutilations, I had won. My enemies were either outside the company, trying to save their careers with patched-up resumes, or trapped inside it, subjected to a system that I myself had created to ensure that nothing escaped my control. The final irony was realizing that, for the market, I was the cold-blooded heroine who had avoided a monumental bankruptcy that would have cost thousands of jobs and billions in market value. For the newspapers and investors, I was the brilliant brain, the revolutionary executive. That deep down, I knew that much of what I had built was driven not just by analytical genius, but by a dark need to prove myself through fear and submission. And while part of me wondered where this would all end, another, far more dominant part fed on this dynamic daily, like a parasitic organism that could no longer exist without the constant pulse of total domination. What had once begun as a silent revenge against those who ignored me in meetings had turned into an empire, shaped by my own will, and I was no longer sure I could live any other way. The following years were an almost natural unfolding of what I had already planted. The company not only stabilized, but began to dominate entire sectors, eyeing smaller competitors before they even had a chance to structure themselves for a fair negotiation. Externally, this was celebrated as an aggressive and visionary strategy, making the covers of specialized magazines that pointed me as the rare type of leader who did not hesitate to do what needed to be done. Internally, it was something much more sinister. Each acquisition was preceded by a silent sweep. My intelligence teams mapped vulnerabilities, analyzed hidden debts, detected cracks in contracts that could be exploited. By the time I finally made the offer, the other side was already so cornered that they rarely dared to bargain. Internally, I implemented an operational model so integrated with the algorithm I created that it became almost impossible to make decisions without consulting it. Entire departments began to operate on automatically generated instructions, based on minute variations in market behavior, or even the emergence of linguistic patterns in public posts that indicated subtle shifts in consumer sentiment. Often, managers didn't even understand the reason for certain cuts or immediate investments. They simply obeyed, because they knew that questioning the system was the same as questioning me. This blind obedience gave me a satisfaction that I would never admit out loud, but that nourished every cell in my body. At the same time, my inner circle grew smaller and smaller. The few who remained were chosen almost like chess pieces, each with a clear role, specific skills, and no trace of ambition that could ever turn against me. To them, I offered unshakable security, exorbitant salaries, bonuses that could guarantee comfortable retirements in a few years, but also an unspoken contract of absolute loyalty. Fear and admiration coexisted in every meeting, permeating the air like a constant electricity. Yet, it wasn't just them who buckled. International banks, Vulture funds, and even local governments began to court my favor. I received invitations to exclusive events, dinners restricted to those with billions in their pockets, panels where investors anxiously awaited my predictions. Every time I took the stage, I felt the old ghost of that invisible analyst hovering behind me, almost as if watching me with a mixture of horror and fascination. It was an uncomfortable memory, but also a visceral reminder of how far I had come. But with this power came other consequences. Lonely nights grew longer. Personal connections became fewer and farther between. Old friends disappeared, swallowed up by distrust or irreconcilable incompatibilities with the world I now inhabited. Many could not deal with what I had become, or with the kind of decisions I made without blinking an eye. Decisions that destroyed careers, tore apart small businesses, and sometimes left hundreds of people without jobs. I could claim that I was doing this for the greater good of the corporation and its shareholders. But deep down, I knew it was also driven by my almost pathological need to consolidate dominance. It was the same drive that had made me endure the silent humiliations of the past, that had driven me to stay up all night coding a secret algorithm, that had driven me to expose and root out every weak link. Now it had simply changed gears. Instead of fighting to be heard in a boardroom, I was fighting to ensure that no one else dared ignore the weight of my voice. This absolute recognition came with an emotional cost that I had learned not to resist over time. It was a peculiar kind of solitude, so deep that it was almost comfortable, because in it I didn't have to maintain a facade of sympathy or fragile emotional bonds. All I had left was control, and the strange peace of commanding an empire built on fear, data, and an intelligence that no one dared challenge. Over time, the company grew to proportions that went far beyond what I had dreamed of in the early days, locked away in a small studio in Brooklyn, surrounded by dirty cups and endless codes. It became a conglomerate that absorbed competitors as easily as it breathed, expanding its branches into sectors that were not even part of its original scope. We began operating in energy, logistics, artificial intelligence for urban services, and even discreetly in surveillance technologies that we sold to governments interested in population control. The most ironic thing was that, in every interview or corporate press release, I emerged as the face of ethical modernity, someone who implemented solid governance and transparent methods. The international press loved this narrative. Magazines made lists of the most visionary leaders of the century, and my name was always at the top, accompanied by praise for my analytical rigor, my strategic coolness, my ability to anticipate economic movements with almost oracular precision. None of these publications, however, had access to the closed-door meetings where we discussed hostile mergers and strategies to stifle promising startups before they could mature. They didn't see the internal reports I reviewed at dawn, pointing out competitors that should be strangled via predatory contracts. Nor did they know about the encrypted conversations I had with lobbyists to undermine legislation that could hinder our operations. Every move was calculated as if it were a war game, and I had no interest in taking prisoners. Within the company, the climate gradually adjusted to my persona. Fear became an almost institutionalized element. Employees knew that poorly written reports or incoherent data were not just grounds for a harsh conversation. They could mean the abrupt end of their careers there. Staff turnover was high, but curiously this did not affect our efficiency. Because, despite everything, the ones who stayed were exactly what I needed. Individuals so committed to results that they were willing to sacrifice their own sanity to deliver what was expected. Some of them, in late-night meetings, with exhausted expressions, would let out looks that mixed gratitude and terror. They knew they were participating in something monumental, one that would probably go down in the business books. But they also understood that I would not hesitate to dismiss them if they showed signs of weakness. This established an almost religious discipline, in which the only faith allowed was in the algorithm that guided us and in me, who understood it better than any other human being. I gained direct access to figures who had previously seemed unattainable. Central bankers would schedule private dinners to hear me, Sovereign wealth funds would send emissaries to try to get a sense of the direction my conglomerate would take in advance, knowing that this could shape entire markets. On these occasions, I would sit at the table and watch their clumsy attempts to decipher my plans, smiling just enough to keep the game going. Power had become a veil around me, so thick it was almost palpable. But even when I was covered in it, there were moments of brief lapses. When, for example, I would walk through the glass-enclosed hallway that connected my office to the data analysis center, and, for a second, I would see reflected in the glass the woman I had become. There was no longer any trace of the eager young woman who sat in the boardrooms hoping to be heard. In her place was someone with a hard gaze, straight shoulders, and an aura of someone who could break entire companies with a wave of the hand. I wondered if this was a victory or just an irreversible mutation. But I quickly dismissed such thoughts because there were decisions to be made, contracts to be finalized, acquisitions to be consolidated, and reports to be analyzed. And each of these movements reinforced the only pillar that really mattered. I was in absolute command, and no one would dare ignore me again. It didn't take long for the culture I had established to spread like an undercurrent, shaping not only the way the company operated, but also the market around us. Partners began to behave differently when they did business with us, adopting an almost servile caution, wary of the strict contracts and clauses I insisted on including, which would strangle any attempt at known compliance. They knew that our legal team was trained, not only to protect our interests, but to preemptively destroy reputations and entire businesses if necessary. Within the board, the mood was one of constant restraint. The older members, who had already witnessed the transformation since the time when I was just a specter at meetings, displayed an almost protocolary obedience, rarely daring to question my decisions. Some new directors, brought in under pressure from international funds, tried to resist in their first meetings. They came armed with colorful charts and prepared arguments, trying to impose revisions to strategies that I had already agreed upon. It only took a few minutes of raw exposure to the real reports my algorithm provided for all the fanfare to melt away. They realized they were dealing with someone operating at a level of information they simply couldn't keep up with, and they quickly retreated, fearing they would be the next victim of a silent purge that no one talked about openly, but everyone knew existed. In parallel, I continued to expand my informal networks. I had analysts spread out in key industry hubs, infiltrating conferences and forums where emerging ideas circulated before they gained traction. This allowed me to capture trends before they even became solid data, giving our company an almost unfair advantage over any competitor. Often I didn't even need to make aggressive acquisitions. I just had to anticipate moves, launch products, or adjust supply contracts to make it impossible for anyone who could become a problem to grow. All of this further fueled the legend that surrounded me, the almost mythological figure who hovered over market reports, silently circulated through global conferences and suddenly reappeared to close billion-dollar deals in private meetings, altering the macroeconomic projections of entire countries. And the more this myth grew, the more I realized the paradoxical loneliness it brought. There was no room for genuine bonds in an environment where every gesture was interpreted as a chess move. Even my few confidants within the structure knew that our relationship was sustained, not by friendship, but by a silent pact of mutual need. They gave me information, loyalty, and absolute discretion. In exchange, they received access to an empire whose bonuses and gratuities could fund future generations. There were no complicit hugs, no sincere jokes at the end of a workday, just a calculated symphony of power, results, and fear. Sometimes I found myself wondering if there was another way. If back then, when I was ignored in so many meetings, I had simply agreed to leave and look for a lesser job, perhaps my life would have taken a different direction, with fewer dollar signs and headlines, but also without the constant weight of knowing that my hand could, in a single movement, devastate hundreds of lives. But any glimmer of regret soon dissipated, crushed by the pragmatism that I had cultivated. Because, in the end, what drove me was no longer revenge against those specific figures from the past. They, after all, had already been swallowed up by my whirlwind, destroyed or rendered irrelevant. What drove me now was the colossal inertia of a system that I myself created, and that needed to keep turning, or it would collapse and take with it everything I had built. It was a machine of infinite hunger, and I was simultaneously its creator, operator, and prisoner. As the fiscal cycles passed, what had once been just a corporate structure evolved into something close to a living organism, pulsing with its own logic and rhythm. Daily reports arrived like veins full of new blood, fueling decisions that were made at an almost automatic pace. I got used to working surrounded by multiple screens, each one overflowing with data from different units, markets, exchange rate variations, and social indices that the algorithm compared with the coldness of someone who did not attribute moral value to any event. All it took was for an indicator to deviate slightly from the standard for me to trigger cuts, redirect investments, or even trigger unexpected orders that invariably resulted in more layoffs and surgical restructurings. It didn't take long for this to become the new normal, an ecosystem where fear served as lubricant for a machine that could not stop. And as much as outside analysts, banks, and funds celebrated the extraordinary results we were delivering quarter after quarter, there was an awkward silence behind the scenes, a kind of tacit consensus that this success had a human cost that few dared to quantify. The irony was that I myself had become the most essential, and, at the same time, the most vulnerable element of the system, because everything revolved around my readings, the way I interpreted the projections, the signals that only I seemed able to decipher amidst the endless tides of numbers and patterns. It was as if I had reached a level of symbiosis with the machine I had created, to the point where there was no longer a clear distinction between where the algorithms ended and my own instincts began. And this created a disturbing paradox. Although I was surrounded by experts, consultants, directors, and entire teams trained to carry out my orders, in the end, all the ultimate responsibility fell on me. If one day my analysis were to fail, if my judgment were compromised by even a microscopic detail, the entire empire could begin to crumble. It was at this point that I realized how I had become a hostage to the very structure I had so painstakingly built. There was no escape, no real respite. Even when I traveled to international meetings, where I stayed in presidential suites with panoramic views that looked like moving paintings, I was always burdened with the burden of having to maintain constant vigilance. The brief moments when I turned off my screens quickly became unbearable, as my mind continued to process data, project scenarios, anticipate problems that might not even exist yet. During sleepless nights, I would pace my hotel room, listening to the muffled sounds of the city below, and imagine how many anonymous faces had their lives directly or indirectly shaped by a simple click of my finger on a control panel. The awareness of this did not cause me guilt. That was a feeling I had almost surgically excised over the years, but rather a kind of clinical fascination, mixed with a slight repulsion, as if I were observing from the outside the creature I had become, recognizing its monstrous efficiency, and at the same time, wondering that it had been born from something so human as the pain of being ignored. Because ultimately, it all began not out of pure ambition, nor greed, but from an invisible wound, slowly opened by averted glances, muffled jokes, and invitations that never came. It was the bitter fruit of years of being treated as invisible, until the only way to exist was to build something so colossal that the world would be forced to pay attention. And now, having achieved this absolute degree of mastery, I found myself perpetually surrounded by armies of professionals who feared me, counsels who obeyed me without question, and analysts who pored over my every word as if it were divine decree, but completely alone. This solitude, however, did not stop me from moving forward with the same almost mechanical precision that defined every aspect of my professional life. If at any point I had harbored any moral hesitation, it had already been completely dissolved by the relentless routine I had built. It was almost impossible to go back. The days followed one another like chapters in a book written with the force of reports and projections, where the plot had no room for emotional pauses or sentimental detours. I would wake up early, review dashboards while still sitting in bed, and respond to critical emails before the sun had even fully risen. Soon after, I would meet with teams spread across different time zones, monitoring operations that were unfolding in markets so varied that I sometimes had to mentally remember which continent I was dealing with. There was something almost hypnotic about the way these processes flowed, interconnected by codes and automated routines that I myself oversaw, creating a web so intricate that no competitor dared even try to decipher it. Efficiency had become a cult, and I, its high priestess, presided over every decision as if it were an indispensable ritual to keep the corporate universe in balance. At the same time, my advisors and directors began to develop small quirks, clear signs of the environment in which we lived. Some began to avoid prolonged eye contact, as if they feared that I could read their thoughts and detect some latent betrayal in them. Others brought absurd piles of documents to meetings, in an attempt to prove their worth by overloading them, fearing being caught unprepared and, consequently, dismissed without warning. This silent fear had become one of the main pillars of my empire, vigorously sustaining what, to the external market, was pure visionary innovation. Sometimes I caught myself observing these executives, studying their tense postures, their contained breathing, and I thought how far the world I had built was from what I had once imagined, when I dreamed only of having a voice heard in a boardroom. Because in the beginning there was none of that, just a genuine desire to show analyzers, point out risks, collaborate. Now, however, every piece of data I released, every projection I authorized, could mean the complete extinction of a line of business, the cancellation of contracts that supported families, the closure of entire factories in distant countries that I would never visit. It was a power of destruction as subtle as it was absolute, exercised by spreadsheets and algorithms instead of tanks or weapons, but its effects were no less devastating. Even so, whenever I pondered this reality, my brain quickly tried to recalibrate its reasoning to pragmatism. It was necessary. The market was ruthless, margins were fragile, and any miscalculation could generate a domino effect, capable of eroding shareholder value at a dizzying speed. I myself had become an expert in exploiting these vulnerabilities in others. It would be the height of naivety to imagine that my conglomerate was immune. So I kept up the pace, constantly reviewing the algorithms, overseeing even the most technical layers of the predictive models to ensure that no inadvertent biases led us astray. At night, after exhausting shifts, I would often sit alone in the large glass room at the top of the headquarters, watching the red and white lights flicker in and out below, as if the city were a pulsing electrical circuit. And there, in the dim light cut through by the reflections of the signs and headlights, I felt a strange combination of triumph and exhaustion, as if I were simultaneously a goddess and a prisoner in a temple of my own making, unable to leave it even if I wanted to. As time went on, I realized that the very notion of victory had morphed into something almost unrecognizable. It was no longer about outdoing those who had once slighted me. They no longer existed, at least not in positions that could affect me. Some, in fact, had disappeared from the corporate radar so completely that I suspected they would never again sit at the decision-making table. What remained was pure, unbroken dominance. A cold supremacy that was not satisfied with hitting targets or setting quarterly records. My conglomerate had reached a point where our own internal standards were more rigorous and ruthless than any external expectations. I set benchmarks that seemed absurd even to veteran analysts, and yet when they were finally met, I felt nothing more than a brief relief soon to be replaced by the quiet pressure of setting the next step. There was no genuine celebration, even at the rare corporate events we organized, filled with expensive wines and meticulously choreographed presentations. I could only see the tension on the faces of those around me, as if they had to maintain their composure, afraid of saying something out of place. On these occasions, I would move among small groups of executives and partners with the calculated posture of someone who completely dominates the room. The conversations invariably revolved around the same topics: future projections, expansion strategies, detailed market analyses. There was no room for banalities, and if someone tried to make a joke or try to lighten the mood, I could quickly tell by my neutral gaze that I wasn't there for that. Thus, the atmosphere quickly returned to a serious, almost reverential tone, which fed me in a somber way. At the same time, this fearful adoration created an invisible wall around me, separating me from the rest of the world with a thickness that grew thicker day by day. On the rare occasions when someone showed a spark of boldness to approach me beyond the strictly professional level, I myself would erect insurmountable barriers. I didn't want, or perhaps I couldn't stand, the idea of intimacy. It was as if in order to sustain the colossal machine I had built, I needed to remain untainted by any bond that could humanize me too much. And yet, there were nights when I would wake up startled, with my heart racing, overcome by confused dreams in which I saw myself back in that first meeting room, invisible, trying to speak and being solemnly ignored. At those times, I would sit on the edge of the bed, breathing deeply, trying to recover the feeling of absolute dominance that accompanied me during the day. Because, even surrounded by achievements that would make any other executive feel untouchable, I carried within me the living memory of neglect, tattooed on my flesh more than any victory could erase. That was the primary fuel that kept everything running, and perhaps that was exactly what made me so dangerously effective. The brutal truth was that I didn't build that empire to prove anything to them. Those figures were already destroyed, erased, irrelevant. I built it for myself, to fill the void that was left when I realized, way back when, that nothing I was or said would have any value if it wasn't accompanied by a force so colossal that it would be impossible to ignore it again. At some point, what began as an obsession with efficiency and mastery transformed into something even more intricate, almost existential. It was no longer just a matter of managing numbers or reports, but of weaving, thread by thread, a parallel reality that was sustained exclusively by the rigor of my algorithms and the precision of my decisions. The company had become a self-sufficient ecosystem, so integrated and interdependent that a simple adjustment to a supply contract in Asia reverberated like an echo in marketing operations in the United States or tax planning in Europe. And I was the only person capable of seeing the big picture, of understanding the invisible connections that extended across departments, continents, disparate legislations, and cultural profiles that would confound even specialized consultants. This gave me such absolute power that I sometimes found myself testing its limits almost unconsciously, approving tiny changes just to see how they would ripple out, monitoring the ripple effects even in the most distant distribution centers, or in the satisfaction reports of customers I would never meet in person. There was something deeply disturbing yet fascinating about this exercise. It was like playing goddess on a living chessboard, whose pieces had no idea that their every move had been carefully calculated long before they even dreamed of acting. At the same time, I noticed that my directors had developed little rituals to deal with the chronic anxiety that our environment generated. Some had taken to keeping physical filing cabinets, even in the digital age, as if they feared a sudden failure in the systems that would leave them defenseless. Others carried discreet amulets, small metal pieces or beads attached to barely noticeable bracelets, trying to summon a luck that they knew, deep down, did not exist in this world governed solely by data and relentless pragmatism. I observed all this with a mixture of disdain and clinical curiosity, fully understanding that these behaviors were inevitable symptoms of the type of regime I had implemented. In practice, it was a form of twisted devotion. Each superstition, each nervous habit, revealed the colossal weight that my decisions exerted on their existence. The curious thing is that, even in this scenario, the market continued to venerate us. Investment funds frantically competed for minority shares in the divisions that I decided to open to foreign capital. even under restrictive conditions. Business newspapers wrote laudatory articles about my strategic vision, highlighting how we had overcome global crises and overcome abrupt drops in commodities that had devastated entire conglomerates. The public saw headlines about successive records and profits so high they bordered on the indecent, but they had no idea of the sleepless nights, the frantic calculations reviewed dozens of times to ensure that no microscopic flaw could expand into a systemic collapse. And above all, I had no idea how much this monumental castle depended on a single variable: my sanity. I myself began to question where lucidity ended, and a subtle form of delirium began, because at certain moments, when contemplating the magnitude of what I had created, an uncomfortable flash of doubt would arise, almost as if a distant part of me were whispering that it was impossible to stop something so gigantic forever. But then I would look back at the reports, at the endless lines of code that sustained the beating heart of my empire, and I would find there a perverse solace. As long as I maintained control, nothing could collapse. But there was something that not even my absolute mastery could contain indefinitely: the silent wear and tear that accumulated within me like sediment deposited year after year. I continued to operate with the same precision as always, reviewing each parameter, reprogramming parts of the algorithm to eliminate even the slightest chance of statistical deviation. But internally, I felt cracks forming in places that had previously been uncheckable. The once productive early mornings began to be populated by circular thoughts that revolved around questions to which I had no answers. I questioned whether I would have come this far if I had been treated with the minimum of respect and listening at the beginning of my career, or whether that original contempt was the necessary push to mold me into the ruthless creature that governed the destiny of so many now. It was a cruel paradox, because I recognized that without those humiliations I might never have developed the hunger to be heard. But at the same time I understood that I had paid for it with the complete amputation of essential parts of my humanity. Even so, there was no going back. The structure I had created would not allow for a less rigorous, less cold-blooded leader, less obsessed with anticipating every risk before it even arose. If I loosened my grip for an instant, the very machinery I had built would devour any trace of vulnerability. I knew this because I had seen her do exactly the same thing with dozens of directors, partners and competitors over the years. There was no room for sentimental hesitation in this game. So I continued, relentless, multiplying audits, redesigning logistics flows, implementing additional layers of predictive analysis that transformed the company into something almost omniscient, capable of capturing micro-oscillations in global consumption patterns before they became measurable trends. This put us years ahead of the market, but it also meant that any mistake I made would have a devastating impact on a nearly continental scale. It was such a colossal tension that I began to feel its effects even in my body. Small palpitations during meetings, an almost imperceptible tremor in my hands that I hid with restrained movements, dark circles under my eyes that were increasingly deepened by neutral makeup. Even so, I kept my face firm, because I understood that more than the decisions themselves, what held my empire together was the undeniable perception that I was always in control, always lucid, always 2 steps ahead. If anyone noticed any crack, it could create the breach that so many were silently waiting for, an opportunity to test my authority, perhaps even conspire against it. And so the cycle perpetuated itself. The more we advanced, the more dependent we became on my personal sieve, which in turn made me increasingly irreplaceable and, therefore, more of a prisoner of this role that once seemed like a crown, but now proved to be an iron yoke impossible to remove. At night, I sat on the couch in the penthouse I had bought solely for the view, gazing out at the endless lights of the city, and trying to remember who I had been before all this. But the memories came back fragmented, like old photographs soaked in rain, distorted and almost unrecognizable. All that remained was the unshakable certainty that there was no going back, that, whether I liked it or not, I had become exactly the kind of force I had once feared and silently hated. It was in this almost permanent state of vigilance that I began to notice curious patterns around me. They were not cold market data or trend reports, but human reactions. Small changes in behavior in the hallways, whispers held in improvised coffees in the lounge on the 42nd floor, glances exchanged between analysts who quickly looked away when I passed. Even immersed in an environment where fear had become the mortar that held everything together, human nature still found subtle ways to try to resist, protect itself, or at least share the silent burden of working so closely with me. Some directors began to adopt almost childish strategies to mitigate the tension. They would prolong unnecessary meetings just to maintain an illusory sense of relevance or to postpone the moment when they would have to present me with critical data. Others redoubled their formality, speaking slowly, choosing each word with extreme care, as if each sentence were being evaluated in a secret court. I observed all this with the serenity of someone who had long understood the game, but also with a touch of contempt, because deep down I knew that no protocol, no exaggerated politeness, could save them if I detected weaknesses or inconsistencies that would jeopardize the balance of what I had built. This gave me a feeling of power so overwhelming that at times it even made me feel slightly physically sick, as if my body were reacting to the realization that no ethical or moral limits were capable of containing the scope of my decisions. However, this same absolute power had a cost that became clearer with each cycle of audits and restructurings. I had come to live in an almost hermetic space, isolated not only from the old colleagues I once had, but from the real world itself. My references had been completely replaced by graphs, pivot tables, and mathematical projections so complex that few data engineers could follow them. This made any attempt at genuine human dialogue almost impossible. At the rare dinners with investors or meetings with politicians seeking support for regional projects, I noticed how the tone of the conversations changed as soon as they approached me. People were more reserved. They laughed less. They tried to demonstrate intellect and sophistication to feel worthy of my attention, even if that only made everything even more awkward. It was a sad but completely predictable theater. The most disturbing thing, however, was recognizing how I myself had stopped seeking any connection outside of this controlled universe. Not because I feared personal betrayal by now. My network of confidentiality agreements, internal audits, and legal protocols was so robust that it shielded me from almost any risk, but because there was no room left in me for the minimal vulnerability that sustains true emotional bonds. I didn't trust anyone enough to allow intimacy, and I also didn't see any practical use for it. The result was an almost pathological but functional isolation that served the purposes of the structure I had created perfectly. Still, sometimes in the silence of the early morning, when all the emails had been answered, the meetings had ended, and the control panel had momentarily stabilized, I felt a cold void open up right in the center of my chest. It was as if my body, finally freed from incessant tasks, took the opportunity to remember that there was something beyond metrics, something that cried out for meaning on a level that my algorithms could never map. However, such a thought was short-lived, soon swallowed up by the avalanche of new notifications that pulled me back to the only world I knew. There was a cruel paradox in everything I had built. On the one hand, the conglomerate was thriving so solidly that it had become practically an autonomous organism, respected and feared by rivals, admired by global funds that competed to inject capital and secure even a fraction of the consistent profits we delivered. On the other hand, this same success pushed me into a spiral of ever more rigorous surveillance, because the bigger the empire, the greater the volume of potential breaches that could emerge, and I was not willing to allow any failure that would undermine the legacy that I had painstakingly built on the rubble of others' inattention. I began implementing additional layers of internal tracking, which analyzed even metadata of internal communications to anticipate subtle signs of collusion or strategic misalignment. If a manager exchanged too many messages with suppliers outside the usual flow, my system triggered automatic alerts. If analysts demonstrated behaviors that were outside the productivity standard, silent interviews would soon begin, conducted by legal teams that operated almost like private investigators. This created a suffocating atmosphere, but at the same time it was guaranteed by the indisputable reality. The results were so spectacular that no one dared to question the methods. On the contrary, newly arrived directors tried to adapt as quickly as possible to this ecosystem, where every detail mattered, because they knew that I had eyes in every direction. This absolute control made me move around the floors of the headquarters with the certainty that no conversation would escape my attention, no deviation would